lethality is a word that's so often used right now in the military, and I think it's fair to say that it's going to be continuously used as China builds up their situation in Taiwan, and infantry are the people who will likely be there if those situations occur.
Right.
How much does that conversation come into discussions with the men and women, and how much is spirituality and connection to God important in those conversations?
The discussion does come up a lot, right? Because they're facing it day to day with that job. While I guess anyone who joins, this is a potential reality. I think the infantry face it more than other professions. And what I've found is, especially during the field times, when I'm out there with the guys out in the field, that's when these discussions really come up, when the guys have more time to contemplate, what they're doing, what this might be an exercise, but hey, if this was real, what would this look like? And that's a conversation that I also try to pull out of them, because the Army's big on spiritual fitness, right? Spiritual readiness. And what does that really look like? So, one thing we hear a lot is that means preparing now for that reality, right? So it's thinking those hard thoughts that people don't want to think about, like, what, if this is real, what is that going to look like? And so I try to have those conversations with young soldiers now. Are they thinking this through? What's it going to look like? For instance, I sat down with my medics during the last big exercise, and sort of talked them through, like, hey, if this was real, these are your friends, God forbid, right, from your unit, right? Have you sat down to sort of think how you're going to handle that? How do you keep working in that situation when, like, you've just lost a bunch of your own friends and it's now your job to keep these guys going? And they've usually very receptive to that, and I think it's an important part of helping them be ready for, God forbid, if they ever actually have to go into combat.
I mean, that's a really interesting, weave to kind of dive into, especially with your experience in psychology, and working on the veteran side, seeing what it looks like on the other end, how important it is to have mental readiness when extreme situations are going to come up, to have already thought about how you're going to deal with those situations.
I think that's the key, because again, we never know how we're going to react if we're given a situation like that. But if we don't prepare, if we just push off the difficult thoughts of what it would be like to be in combat, to be losing friends, right, to be away from home in those kinds of situations, if we never put ourselves in that mindset of how we're going to build resolve and strength, and then you're thrown into it, by that point it's too late, right? Because by that point you're just in survival mode. And if you didn't do that work, it's like anything in life, right? If you want to be a marathon runner, right, you can't just stand up one day and run a marathon, right? So it's the same thing with our spiritual fitness, right? We need to put in the work now in peacetime, right, in order to strengthen ourselves. What are we going to rely on, right? When you're, God forbid, you've been away from home 18 months in combat, right? What is that thing you're going to rely on that's going to push you through? And that's the work that I try to get soldiers to do now, so that, God forbid, if the time comes, it's not already too late and they're just left scrambling.
In those conversations, is there any insight or anecdotes or that you can enlighten us on what those conversations actually look like?
I think, unfortunately, what I see is, and we're in an interesting time in the military where we have a lot of senior leaders who are from the war years, and they've multiple deployments and and they've lived through this. And then you have a whole younger generation that haven't experienced this yet. And so there's an interesting dichotomy between these two.
So when you say the war years, what you mean?
Iraq and Afghanistan, right?
Yeah.
So most of our senior leaders now in the battalion and brigade, these guys have multiple deployments, years of experience. They've been through combat, right? And then you have an interesting cut of the younger generation that avoided all those years, right? And so what I find is, when I talk to the older guys, they've developed these things over years. But the younger ones, what I find a lot of times is, unfortunately, they haven't really thought these things through yet. And so these are the first time, as I'm sort of guiding them through these thoughts, hey, how would you handle, you don't have a cell phone for 18 months, right? You can't reach home, but other than, right? So sometimes this is the first time I've really thought that through. And I think sometimes it's a difficult thing to think about. It's one thing to be excited about your job and be out there and doing what they do, but when the reality of what that would look like, and so that's, I wouldn't say I've seen necessarily an exact trend, but except other than most of them have not really taken the time to think that through.